Fantastic. Okay, and everyone is here. Great. Let's get started then. So today we have a CNS talk, which we run once a month, usually on the third Wednesday at 4 p.m. European time. And today we have Sahba Besharati, which is a great joy for me because we've crossed paths for over 10 years in various countries in different capacities. And she's actually been one of the earliest supporters of the CNS seminars back when they were still in person and lunchtime seminars attended by only 10 people. But now she's all grown up and has developed her own independent research line, and I'm super excited to hear about her latest research. So just a little bit of background. Sahba is a neuropsychologist and social-affective neuroscientist. She's also the co-founder and joint director of the Wits University Neuroscience Research Lab, Wits NeuRL, where they aim to promote neuroscience research conducted in a South African context. It's a long list, brace yourselves. Sahba is also a C1 rater researcher. Now I'm going to do the whole list, Sabs. Just, I know, gonna make you uncomfortable now, but it's impressive. She's a C1 rater researcher of the South African National Research Foundation and a current fellow with the New Mind Institute at Wits University. And she was previously a global scholar of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research in Brain, Mind and Consciousness, the program. She's also a editor on the board of Communications Biology with Springer Nature and the American Psychology Association Journal. And she's also actively involved in capacity building in neuroscience for underrepresented researchers, where she has been invited to talk and participate in UNESCO and World Health Organization consultation and advances in neurotechnology. Now, I skipped the research bit because I'm going to leave that up to you to talk about your latest research centered around is embodiment a universal experience from brain matter to diversity matters? Sahba, please take it away.
Thank you, Steph, for the kind and very long invitation. Well, long description, but the very kind invitation. Like Steph said, I was a PhD student many years ago now, and I originally attended these seminars in person, and it's a real honor to be here and present to you all virtually and be a part of this kind of like movement towards open access science through the many initiatives that Steph and her team lead. So hello to everybody joining virtually now and also offline later. So I'm going to start with a little bit of older research, and then I'm going to move into some of the newer research. Bear with me. I apologize to Steph earlier on that this is a very unpolished talk. Some of it I've presented before, a lot of it I haven't presented before, so I'm taking a very philosophical kind of approach where you are presenting your ideas, and I would really like some engagement and feedback because a lot of what I'm going to be discussing is sometimes sensitive in nature. It's hard to talk about, so it's nice to actually present it to an audience before you publish. But some of the work is older and more grounded. So let's have some fun together. So to start off, when thinking about the main question that my research addresses is, how do I know that I'm self-aware? How do I know that this is me? How do I know that this, in fact, is my body? How am I aware that my audience has a mind, or do you? And so through a series of experimental work, some of which I'll speak to today, we've really argued that, we're not just selves in the world, we're brains and bodies that are immersed in the social world. And this ability to create a sense of self-awareness isn't done in isolation. It's done in the context of other people. So to reach these kind of conclusions, some of the experimental work I'll cover today, we use integrative methods. So starting with human lesion studies, and later moving to what's known as neurotechnology that also speak to that encompasses a range of methods from MRI, EEG, immersive virtual reality. And in using these neurotechnologies, especially in an African context, but also in other low resource settings, what we really found is that immersed and really embed within these neurotechnologies are systemic prejudices and a lack of representation, which not only undermines the validity of a lot of the methods we use, but also what we really know. So if our research is biased in terms of representation and in terms of our methods, are the scientific conclusions we're reaching really valid? And so the question that I'd like to start off today, and I'd like you to kind of keep with you throughout the duration of the talk, is in your own research, in your own science, how do structural inequalities and a lack of diversity impact what you're researching? And so why is this question important? Why is consciousness important? And how do we body in looking at this question of self-awareness? But this is a really long-lasting question. We've asked it for many years. Philosophers have asked it. Clinicians have asked it. But it's becoming more and more important to answer, especially in the age of AI. So its application to consciousness and AI is really critical. AI is becoming more and more in terms of the forefront of what we're doing in research and in consciousness science. And so what I would like to do, and I'm not going to speak about the developmental work today, just because I'm speaking about many things, so there isn't time to go into the developmental work, but it's really nice to also take a life course approach. So to look at the breakdown of things like self-awareness and consciousness and disorders that I'll speak to, but also look at the building blocks. So how does self-awareness emerge in the context of other people from a developmental perspective? And then looking at this life course approach, so developmentally through disorders of self-awareness, we can also use it or use methods called neurotechnologies. And later on, towards the end of the talk, I'll focus on what we've been doing on immersive virtual reality. Okay, so with a little bit of framing, just so you know what to expect, I'll start off by speaking about some older work that looked at disorders of self-awareness, focusing on MRIs and neurotechnology and stroke studies. Then I'll move from brain matters into diversity matters, thinking about these questions of access and representation, the social relevance and social importance of neuroscience, and then finally, really look at an alternative method of studying studying embodied self-awareness through immersive virtual reality. So before then, a little bit more framing. So I'd like to challenge you all today a little bit to really position yourself in the research. So a lot of us like to think of ourselves as objective scientists, but hopefully towards the end of the talk, you'll agree with me that there's a lot more subjectivity in our science than we actually think there is. And so together with other early career fellows that come from previously underrepresented groups, we put together a symposium not so long ago at the Global International Neuropsychological Society Symposium, and we kind of gave this task to our audience. So for those, please do the same thing. Think about yourself a little bit, engage in a little bit of introspection, and position yourself in the research. So who are you, and how does who you are influence what you study? So if you don't know a little bit about me personally, I was given a really nice, warm, professional introduction, but I'm Sahba. I'm a first immigration from a Persian background, and my parents, so I've always been aware that in another world, in another social context, as a woman and as a Baha'i, I would have been denied an education and denied many of my basic human rights. I'm also a mother of two children, and mi marito italiano. So I grew up, and my kids continue to grow up in a multicultural and multilingual home. And so in telling you a little bit about myself personally, you'll see why this becomes important later on in the story of this research, but also try to do the same. Think about your background, who you are, and if this actually also influences what interests you and what you study. So now, of disorders of self-awareness. So in looking at how do we study embodied self-awareness, one very old technique that we've continued to use over the last 10 years or so through our research has looked at this question of bodily self-awareness through neurological disorder. And so imagine you wake up in the hospital one day and you don't know why you're there. The doctors tell you you've had a stroke, but you're not so sure. The doctors tell you that you're paralyzed in the left side of the body, but you think you can move your arm without help. Sometimes you even feel that your arm doesn't belong to you. these are the kind of clinical observations that some of you in the room right now have also heard on many occasions. And they are grouped together in two kind of clinical phenomena known as anosognosia for hemiplegia and stomatoparaphrenia. So anosognosia involves damage to the right side of the brain where you're paralyzed on the left side of the body, and patients are completely unaware of their left side of paralysis. Where in stomatoparaphrenia, they also have damage to the right side of the brain, they're paralyzed on the left side of their body, but they have feelings of non-belonging. So sometimes they just have a feeling, this phenomenal sensation that their limb doesn't belong to them. Other times they even attribute ownership to another person. And so in studying these patients for many years now, we've used a variety of methods, including lesion mapping methods, neuropsychological testing, and psychophysiological experiments. And together with a group of researchers that I'll get to later, we've really focused on the social impact and social perspective taking within these disorders of self-awareness. So what we've argued is that we firstly have to understand the social world. So the social world is social in nature and so it involves what's called the first
sorry
person
to
perspective.
interrupt
So
you.
myself. Oh,
Sorry to interrupt you.
good?
There's quite a lag, so I was wondering if you maybe could switch off your video while you're presenting. That
I
may improve
can.
the audio.
Would you like me to change my Wi-Fi?
Uh, If you can choose, that may do the trick.
I'm gonna use mobile. I'm gonna do both. I'm gonna turn off my camera
It's not
and I'm
too
just
bad,
gonna,
but there's a bit of a lag, so it'd be nice to,
oh, I'm gonna change my Wi-Fi connection and just let me know.
yeah. And I also forgot to warn everyone how quick she speaks. It's hard to get in there.
At that point,
Maybe it was my computers.
All right. Is it any better now?
Seems to be better now. Let's see how it goes. If
All
not,
right.
I'll
Now
try
you
and
have
tell
my
you.
virtual avatar, which is really nice. And now
Beautiful.
it's the social pressure, thinking about social perspective taking. The social pressure's off because there's no camera. It's always nice not to have the egocentric first person perspective. And so yeah, and thinking about what characterizes the social world, we have the first person egocentric perspective. We have what's called the second person perspective. So it's the other, but that's related to the self. And we have a third person perspective. That's the other unrelated to the self. So together with what I'd like to call the anosognosia dream team, Katerina Fatopoulou, Paul Jenkinson, and Valentina Moro and I have put together a series of experimental studies over the last 10 years that have really looked at these disorders of embodied self-awareness through the social lens. So anosognosia for hemiplegia and related disorders that are disorders of embodied self-awareness are not only disorders in what I showed you before, the first person perspective, but they also involve social perspective taking deficits. So when you show them themselves in mirrors and videos, which is a third person perspective, they can actually reintegrate a sense of self. Now, these deficits in third person perspective taking are also kind of specific to what's called allocentric mentalization. So these patients can't really take the perspective of a third person other. And this is through verbal perspective taking or through mentalizing tasks. We've also found that the social context is important. The environment and the social context in which they're in is important. We've also looked, and I'm running through very quickly some of this work, some of the neurocorrelates together with Stephanie Forkel a few years ago now that use voxel-based lesion symptom mapping to actually show that areas related to social cognition are directly related to this inability to take a third person perspective. And more recently, together with Valentina Paicella at the Bordeaux Brain Hack in 2023 now, as part of the Neuroscience Alliance, we use Chris Fallon and Michel Thibault Duchalten's BCB toolkit to actually look at white matter connectivity within these patients, which was really exciting. And again, we showed that there was not only an association between disorders of embodied self-awareness and the social self, so social cognition, but also in terms of white matter disconnection, which leads to our central argument that bodily self-awareness, which can be seen as a minimal sense of self, is actually socially mediated. It involves other people. To create a sense of self-awareness, we do this not in isolation, but in the context of others. And so we've argued towards a dynamic model of the self that involves the first person and a third person perspective. And in looking at disorders of perspective taking or disorders of self-awareness, what there really is going on within these neurological patients is a disconnection between a first person and a third person perspective, which we've shown in experimental and anatomical evidence. And so why is this important and why is this relevant for emerging neurotechnologies? So as many of you maybe already know, the World Health Organization has argued that neurological disorders are now account for the highest burden of disease. This includes stroke, traumatic brain injury, and this also allows us to see research in a different light. It's not only clinically important, but it also gives us access to really important, unique clinical populations that allow us to answer really interesting and important questions like embodied self-awareness. And so when we think about doing this kind of research in low context and low income settings, they can be really effective in terms of pioneering rehabilitation techniques. Things like mirror and video rehabilitation is very easy to administer. It's very cost effective. We can use it in other kind of disorders, not just in stroke and dementias and in schizophrenia. And the central argument here is that perspective taking is important. It's a powerful tool. And hopefully very quickly, even with my internet disconnection, we've shown that we can study this using very cheap neuroimaging technologies like clinical MRI scans, also experimental methods. But how else can we study perspective taking? What other methods are actually available to us? Which leads to the second critical part of the talk is, why is diversity important? So we're moving from brain matters towards diversity matters. And so for those of you in the audience, either offline or online, it's important to just kind of reframe a little bit and think about what are neurotechnologies. They involve a range of things. Some of the techniques you might be very familiar with, including magnetic resonance imaging, also EEG techniques. We can also use this within different settings like neurofeedback or hyperscanning, not just in our traditional EEG, ERP research paradigms, FNIAs, and also virtual reality. And I've tried to showcase a little bit from our lab, Victoria, Johanni and Michelle, that have really pioneered a lot of these techniques within an African context, which is very difficult. It's a low resource setting to do. MRI research within these contexts is very hard. There's a medical infrastructure to do them, but we'll get to portable scans, portable scanners, which is a fast emerging technology. Ryan Wagner has gotten funding for, I think, the first portable MRI scanner in Africa, which will hopefully be up and going soon. But to be there with machine learning institutes like pioneers in the field, such as Benjamin Rossman. But going back to the kind of neuroimaging techniques that are available to us in low resource settings, with the exception of maybe portable magnetic resonance imaging, things like EEG, FNIAs, and virtual realities are just cheaper and more accessible for us to use. And so in experimental settings, they're more effective. And not to say that MRI can't be used, but it needs a lot more infrastructure, which is which requires collaborations with AI and machine learning, which is actually quite advanced in contexts like South Africa. Okay, so in thinking about global access to neurotechnologies, it's not just the physical infrastructure, it's also, can you do the analysis? Do you know it's not just the hardware, it's the software. Do you know how to run the analysis? What kind of training do we need? And so together with Kate Cockcroft, in the last few years, thinking about building neuroscience capacity, we established our neuroscience research lab, Wits NeuRL, that's placed actually in the humanities, which is quite odd for a neuroscience research lab. I wonder how many of you are based in a neuroscience research lab. It's usually not in the humanities. It's usually in a medical setting, in a science setting. But in South Africa, we study psychology within the liberal arts. It's a liberal arts degree, it's a humanities degree. And so even as a neuropsychologist, your training is within the liberal arts, or as we like to call them in South Africa, in the humanities. And so having a neuroscience lab within the humanities gives us a different kind of perspective. We use similar methods, but we also think differently. We're trained to think differently. We're trained to think clinically, critically as well, and to think about neuroscience methods like neurotechnologies for social purposes. So what we've tried to do within Wits NeuRL is not just study the brain within a South African context, but also use it to address socially important questions. And really capitalize is probably not a really nice word to use, but capitalize on the diverse research landscape available to us. And so as I briefly, or maybe very quickly, because I do speak fast, said at the beginning of the talk, is when thinking about a lot of these methods and in using them, for example, in our EEG lab, we've become quite harshly aware that systemic racism is really embedded within our methods. EEG wasn't made for diverse hair. Most of the time, people with braids or very curly hair or different kind of hair texture, or even using different kinds of hair products, are just excluded from research. You can't do that within a South African context because the majority of your population is Black. And so you're really confronted with the harsh realities of systemic racism and the actual technologies that you're using. We also know this through our neuropsychological tests. We don't have norms available, not just for countries like South Africa, but also for populations within the global north. Within many of the populations or many of the countries that you live, there are multicultural settings. And the norms that you're using within the UK or the US, for example, are not made for the diverse populations within these high-income contexts. I could be wrong here. I'd like to, if there is time for questions, it'd be nice to get feedback on this as well. But even our normative templates and MRIs, we know are hugely biased. They were made on, young Harvard graduates. Recently, there weren't even normative templates for older people, let alone for babies and children. And it's not to say, the interpretation of this has to be a bit tricky. It's not to say that your brain is anatomically different when you come from a diverse background, but there can be different structural differences. So using normative templates in itself, it seems like an objective standardized method, but it's hugely biased. And this is actually why diversity matters. If we don't diversify our methods, number one, it reduces the validity of our methods. Number two, it just generates further bias. A lot of the data that we have generated or that we are generating are now being added to big data sets to generative AI. And so what's happened is that our racial biases, our age biases, our gender biases are really embedded within what we'd like to call objective sciences. And so these objective sciences, again, thinking about the importance of yourself in research and subjectivity, are biased by a lack of diversity. And this is going to be an ongoing challenge until we kind of really confront and realize that diversity matters within our science. As a side note, so these aren't just African problems. They're not just diversity isn't just important for an African context. It's important for all contexts. As I said before, even for those of you that are living in high-income settings, within those high-income settings, there are shared realities with low-income contexts. More and more, we're moving, whether we like it or not, whether the political climate is agreeable to it or not, we're moving towards multicultural, multilingual environments. And we need to kind of confront the lack of diversity and the implicit and explicit biases embedded within our methods. And so in thinking about the methods that we use, or even the data that we're using, especially in the age of open access, again, I'm posing two questions for you to think critically, since we're coming from a humanities background now, is where does your data come from? Who was it collected on? In what context was it collected on? Thinking back to those very quick results that I showed earlier on, is that even something like self-awareness doesn't emerge in isolation. It emerges in the context of other people who may also be diverse, and other environments. The social context is important fundamentally for our phenomenal experience of the world. And our social context is diverse in nature. We can't ignore that social diversity. All right, so unfortunately, you have me presenting to you today. Who you really should have presenting to you today is Professor Olivia Machabane. She is a neuroethicist in Stellenbosch in South Africa, but she's also worked in the US for some time at the University in Cape Town. She's really an expert and an advisor on building ethical frameworks towards neurotechnologies. And her work is really powerful because it gives an African voice to the global space. I've highlighted a few of our articles here, where she makes similar arguments that cultural diversity is really crucial, not just for African neuroethics, but for neuroethics globally on a global scale. And I'll say this again later on, but topics, regardless of the political climate in the world right now, but topics like equity, diversity, and inclusion aren't just a sideline conversation. They're actually critical to our science because they're who we study, and it involves the methods that we study. So if I've achieved one thing today is to kind of reframe the way we think about questions of equity, diversity, inclusion. It's not an endpoint to a meeting agenda. It should really be at the top of our priorities. All right. So, am I making anybody feel uncomfortable by saying any of this? I wish there was a physical audience. I hope not. But speaking about diversity isn't easy. It really isn't easy. It's sensitive. It involves race. It involves gender, sexuality, religion, age, nationality. It can make people feel uncomfortable. And we also have to confront our own biases. This is going back to why positionality is important. You know, as objective scientists, we don't always think about who we are. But as I shared with you a little bit about my personal story and my background, that's important. To think about who we are allows us to confront our own implicit biases. And if we don't do this, it leads to ethical dilemmas, right? It affects the kind of research questions we ask, the kind of populations that we investigate. And so again, moving from brain matters to why diversity is actually really critical here. And so together with Akiemi, Rufus Akiemi, we've proposed this equitable neuroscience framework that really looks at the potential of African neuroscience, but also provides an equitable framework that we can use in the African context, but also beyond in thinking about working with diverse populations, minority groups, underrepresented populations. And within this framework, something that's really critical is capacity building and neuroscience training. And so last year, not so long ago, a few months ago, together with Alina Ferreira Correa and a really team of all-star co-organizers, we put together the first South African brain hack. And actually, all the participants were really a part of this initiative, of building neuroscience capacity, not just in South Africa, not just in Africa, but within underrepresented contexts. If you have your phone on you, scan this QR code. Chris Filon has put together a really, really nice little summary video. It'll make you all jealous of not being a part of the South African brain hack experience, but hopefully there'll be many more of these experiences and these training opportunities offered through multiple portals, including the Neuroscience Alliance. I think the next one is in Bordeaux in October, so look out for that. Okay, so in thinking about, what makes us aware of ourselves, what makes us aware of others, and looking at these questions through disorders of self-awareness, we've argued that embodied self-awareness is actually socially mediated. And looking at the importance of other people, of the social context, we've moved from brain matters to why diversity matters and why it actually impacts the kind of questions we asked, the kind of science we do, and the methods we use. And finally getting to the heart of another way we can study embodied self-awareness, and that's through immersive virtual reality. And so traditionally, beyond human lesion studies that I've already talked about, it's very hard to actually experimentally study bodily self-awareness. I mean, can I take a piece of my arm off? I hope not. Yeah, it's really difficult to isolate things when you're looking at the body and the self. That's why you usually, in human lesion studies, you have to kind of wait for people to have a very specific stroke, which is a difficult thing to do, especially as a PhD student when you need lots of participants. And it's also a little bit morbid because you're waiting for people to have a life tragedy. But yes, lesion studies are a very powerful technique. Thankfully, there are other experimental paradigms like the rubber hand illusion that very famously now has allowed direct manipulation of certain body parts. So for those of you that don't know the rubber hand illusion, your hand is actually taken away from your self view and a rubber hand is put in front of you. But the rubber hand is stroked at the same time as your actual hand. And so through multisensory integration, you get the phenomenal feeling that your arm isn't your arm anymore. The rubber hand has become a part of your body. So it allows you to directly and experimentally investigate the sense of body ownership. And this has been done in multiple ways over the years. There's also a lot of criticism around these techniques now as well. We have, of course, also done this in human lesion studies using voxel-based lesion symptom mapping to show that the sense of embodying the other arm is actually related to the right insula. And really interesting, in these clinical patients that I very quickly described to you, you didn't have to do any experimental manipulation. If you put the rubber arm in front of them, they immediately took ownership. And that's one of the main conclusions of the rubber hand illusion, is that our sense of bodily self-awareness is easily changeable. You think that it's not, but it's actually very malleable. And we've seen this time and time and again in immersive virtual reality as well. So immersive virtual reality, virtual reality in general, but the immersive part is really important because it allows for a whole body kind of manipulation. So through moving your body in the virtual world, and I'll hopefully kind of give you an example of how we've tried to do this in the lab, you get a whole body illusion. And by getting a whole body illusion, that's a really powerful method. It's ecologically valid. It has a range of applications. Me and Steph, before the beginning of this talk, we're having a kind of side conversation. It really, in many ways, is the future. It's becoming cheaper and cheaper to get a VR device. I'd love to see a show of hands of who has one, but unfortunately, that's not possible. But I think a lot of people are having it, not just for gaming. It's moving into like the realm of smartphones. It's becoming more and more accessible. It can have clinical applications. For those of you that have been to museums lately, a lot of museums also have a virtual reality component. You can just play it with your smartphone. It's not immersive in nature, but we're moving to that direction. It's also being used in educational settings to bring equitable access. So if your classroom doesn't have a teacher, you can have a virtual teacher and you can be in a virtual teaching environment. And so I think there's a lot, the future of neurotechnologies, I think in general, will also move towards using immersive virtual reality. But in terms of this question of bodily self-awareness, it's a very powerful tool because it allows us to directly and experimentally manipulate the body like we've never been able to as well. So if we think about the importance of perspective taking, which, although I show the results very quickly, that we've shown in over and over again in human lesion studies, as well as in experimental studies like the rubber hand illusion, taking the perspective in another person shapes not just our awareness of self, but it can also shape our beliefs and our attitudes. And so, yeah, just we've had a lot of fun over the years. I'll get to the story of how we've used VR. Sarah Higgins is here. Rashad is here. They were some of the early pioneers in the kind of work that we've been doing. And so, in thinking about this question of embodied self-awareness, I've studied this for a long time, and it's quite surprising that most people don't actually speak about the body in a neuroscience perspective. If you go to a talk on the body, in a humanities talk, people talk about, social aspects of the body. But when you speak about bodily self-awareness or bodily self-consciousness, the physical characteristics of the body are often ignored. It's not neutral. The body is racialized. Its stiffness are often seen through, how you look, your body size, sometimes your religion. And my internet is unstable again. How is it from your side? Let me see if I can see a face.
You're back now. We lost you there for a second, which I think was just that the body is not neutral. So
yeah,
we're back on track.
Difficult topics. We needed a break. But okay, great. I'm glad I'm back. So, I mean, even depending on what you wear or how you choose to grow out your hair or the facial hair you have, you can tell religion by the way a person looks or presents themselves, even wealth. you can see about levels of cleanliness and hygiene. There's a lot that you can tell in terms of social characteristics from the body, but this isn't talked about in consciousness research. You know, we don't talk about these social elements of the body. And going back to the argument that I made before is that when we think about things like diversity, inclusion, equity, they're not just side conversations. If you're a consciousness researcher, if you're interested in questions of the self, you know, we need to accept that the self isn't neutral. The self is embedded within a wider history and a wider social content. You know, you don't just study the brain. I think many of you here, many of you listening are anatomists maybe, because this is a clinical neuroanatomy seminar, but you know, you don't just study the brain, you study the brain within a body, the importance of the body, and the body is a part of the sense of self, which is within a wider social environment. And so what's really been exciting, Mel Slater, who's really the pioneer in this kind of work, but together with a team of researchers, including Tabitha Peck, have used immersive virtual reality and used this, this powerful manipulation of body awareness and body ownership to actually change attitudes. And they've done this in terms of gender-based violence, in terms of, you know, understanding what it feels like to be in the body of your victim or to be in the body of another gender identified person. But they've also done this with what's known as race. But what is race? You know, does race even exist? Race, as we know, is a social construction, and there has been quite controversial, I'd like to think, statements saying that, you know, we should just take race out of neuroscience. If it's a social construction, why should we even have it there? The counter argument, which I think is really important, is that racism is real. Race might be a social construction, but racism and the effects of racism are there. And trying to take things like race or even gender out of neuroscience takes away the lived experience of what it feels like to walk around in a brown body, or what it feels like to walk around in the body of a woman. And these embodied experiences, these phenomenal experiences, and these lived experiences go back to this idea that the body isn't neutral, that it is really, yeah, there's a lot of these social characteristics that become a part of our phenomenal experience. Okay, so luckily for me, as a PhD student, my paths crossed with Dr., maybe he's a professor now, Harry Farmer, at the Aegina Summer School in Greece. It was an embodied summer school. It was a great summer school. We were all on a Greek island together, and it was the first time that I actually came across these ideas and thinking about embodied self-awareness, but not through like the traditional clinical lens. I'm a neuropsychologist by background, but like I said, I studied within the humanities. So I thought about race, I thought about, social constructionism, the narrative self, but I never really merged these two together until I came across Harry Farmer's work. And so he used the rubber hand illusion, but he looked at the element of skin color and how that kind of affected the illusion. And interestingly enough, in all his work, he actually never used one Black participant. He did his research in the UK, and it just wasn't available to him. It wasn't available to him. And I was back to the summer school, I think was about in 2014. And when I was still a postdoc in 2019, I started reading some of his recent work, and I said, well, we should be doing this kind of thing in the South African context. For those of you that know anything about South Africa, apartheid is a very real lived reality for many of us, but we don't understand the mechanisms of prejudice. And even Mel Slater and others that are doing really powerful work in terms of using immersive virtual reality to understand the mechanisms of attitude change and how embodied self-awareness and putting yourself in the perspective of other people can actually change prejudiced attitudes like racism and sexism and ageism. This is still not done on diverse populations. And so many years ago, me and Harry started this kind of conversation and this project to create an immersive virtual reality. We think there are virtual reality labs, but not immersive virtual reality labs on the continent. And he came down in 2023, and we had a really kind of nice symposium together with Gosha Lipinska that also has another virtual reality lab in Cape Town. And, we really started on this journey. And I think this timeline is really important because 2014 is a long time ago for initial ideas. 2019 was maybe the start of the collaboration. So it tells you that good science, or at least for some of us, and if this is what you call good science, takes time. It can be a really slow process for those of you that want to collaborate with people in the African context or in other low resource settings. As I'll get to now, things take time. The infrastructure isn't there. You really have to start from nothing and work your way up. And regardless of the study result, it's really exciting just to share the story with you all today. And for those early career researchers, just as a side comment, I have a lot of side agendas in this talk. I can't emphasize the importance of like summer schools and winter schools, not conferences. Conferences are great, but summer schools and winter schools are just really, really special because there's no pressure. The focus is on students. You really make long-lasting friendships, and these friendships are your future collaborations. So they're not doing the Agena Summer School. Hopefully they'll restart it again. I hope so. But there is the CIFAR Neuroscience of Consciousness Winter School. This is the advert from 2022, but they do have it every year. So look out, please apply and just be on the hunt for not only conference, summer school and winter school opportunities. All right, so what did we do with Harry? And so we had this conversation and I'm like, okay, we should do this. And we both agreed, but where do we start? There was no lab, there was no infrastructure. I couldn't apply for much money as a postdoc. And so luckily we crossed paths with Professor William Daniels, who really is one of the founding fathers of Southern African neuroscience. He's really done a lot to promote neuroscience, not just within South Africa and Southern Africa, but across the continent. And he was clever enough to actually purchase some virtual reality equipment. So we started off kind of tweaking his virtual reality equipment. As I said before, these topics can be sensitive. A few local collaborators that were supposed to kind of build the worlds for us pulled out to say, we can't do neuroscience research on race. No, they're going to think we're racist if we do research on race, which again begs the question of who does this kind of research? Does it matter who you are? Does it matter what your background is? But we kind of, stuck it out with the encouragement from Willie and from Harry. And we had this kind of central question to say, all right, can we kind of develop the methods to think about if embodying another avatar from a different race group can really lead to a reduction of prejudice? We were lucky enough to be runners-up in the eLife Sciences Prize. The Ben Barres Spotless Award is a really great prize for those of you that are early career researchers looking to set up a lab. It's really dedicated to empowering those from underrepresented backgrounds and contexts. And so with a little bit of eLife funding and then some more funding from CIFAR, we managed to actually build we're not sure, but maybe the first immersive virtual reality lab in Africa. And this is the real team that was responsible for that. I really hope Daniela will forgive me for choosing not such a flattering photos. The only one I had available, everybody else had professional headshots almost, but there's been lots of students and trainees. Some are still around, some have moved on that have worked with us over the years in kind of building the needed infrastructure and setting up the foundation for this kind of work. And so in building up, while we were building up the lab and in thinking about the questions that haven't been asked, we put out a really interesting systematic review published in Virtual Reality, led by the wonderful Sarah Higgins, that reviewed in the end 12 papers and performed a meta-analysis on these papers that did some kind of work on using immersive virtual reality to reduce prejudice, focusing on race, not any kind of prejudice, but racial prejudice. And so interestingly enough, in all of these studies, not one of them looked at including or had the opportunities to include Black participants. They were all done on white participants or on Asian participants. And I mean, this is a big problem. Who is the object of racism most of the time? The person that's the object of racism isn't included in these studies for multiple reasons. Maybe access to neurotechnologies in certain contexts, maybe access to certain kinds of populations. And so in reviewing this kind of work and looking at the results of the meta-analysis, we came up with 4 core recommendations. And similar things actually also arose when we were building the virtual reality lab and also creating the virtual worlds. One is, yes, there's a huge problem with participant diversity. The samples used within these studies usually don't actually include underrepresented population, specifically Black identifying participants, but also the avatars. And so when we were building the world, we couldn't find diverse avatars. If we could find diverse avatars, they were also hugely stereotyped. They were all blue collar workers. We couldn't, they had stereotypical hair or stereotypical facial features. I showed you the timeline. It's taken us a long time to get this far. So last year, actually, Google released a whole series of open access avatars that are incredibly diverse, and it's a resource we should all be using. So the field is moving towards that direction. Faster than us, but it's still slow. We're very slow, but the field is actually also at least catching up a little bit. But we've also found problems in how we measure embodiment. In clinical work, we have the same problems. How we usually measure by one question or by like a psychometric questionnaire, but it doesn't always give you the real experience. We need multimodal methods to kind of study embodiment. There's also problems in how we measure racial biases. And then standardizing the hardware and software. For those of you that are in MRI research or EEG research, is usually quite a standard protocol. From what we found, at least within this area of immersive reality, it's a wild show. You can use anything available to you, and it really is difficult to kind of standardize the methods. And so a few snapshots of how we've kind of created this lab. We've also really tried to be open in our approach and bringing in schools, bringing in visitors to kind of co-design. It was really nice. My family came with me once, my kids, my husband could try it out. And it's nice to kind of have these co-design experiences and really building these kind of neurotechnology infrastructures within the community as well. Okay, so we're towards the end of the talk, and I'm going to finally get to a little bit of the main study that we finally managed to do after a really long tenure journey. So we think that we've recruited the largest sample of Black identifying participants ever in not just immersive virtual reality, but probably in virtual reality. But the immersive part is important because doing immersive work is hugely difficult, not just for low resource context, but I think in the world it's very difficult, like we showed in the systematic review, to actually have like rigorous methods and how we use the proper hardware and the proper software to do this. But we've really struggled to get white identifying participants. We have over 100 and we have barely 20 white identifying participants. We don't know if this would be the same in other parts of the world, but South Africa race is highly sensitive and highly difficult. And the kind of feedback, the soft feedback we've gotten is that people are also scared that they'll do this and then be called a racist. They're scared of what they're going to find out about themselves. And so that's in itself interesting. It would be interesting to do this kind of work in other contexts to see if you have a similar problem. It doesn't look like it because other studies were able to recruit white identifying participants. So it might be context specific to us. But in the first study that we've really piloted with the new IVR lab, it's a 2x2x2 experimental design. So we have group, we have self-identifying white participants, self-identifying Black participants. We have synchrony. So to be able to, embody the avatar, you either have synchronous movements. So what you see from a first person perspective looking down, I'm going to show you my video. I'm looking at my video thinking that you're going to see me, but you can't. So looking down at yourself, so first person perspective, and also in a mirror is in synchrony. And then you also have the asynchronous. So in theory, asynchronous should lead to less embodiment, doesn't always. And then you have the avatar. I'll turn off my video just now as well. So you have the avatar. So the avatar can be the same as you. So it can be Black identifying, or it can be different, white identifying. And these were all female participants, by the way, as well. We used a Vive system to create this full body illusion, and we programmed this in Unity. But what was interesting is that we used both qualitative and, it's qualitative twice. That is an incorrect slide. Both quantitative and qualitative measures, which is really exciting, or what I at least find really exciting. So big thanks to Stash. It's been so hard to collect this data that it's now that we have it, like, what do we do with all this data? We have all this kind of rich data. So we really just started looking at the embodiment scores. And back to the question of, is embodiment a universal experience? Is it experienced differently? Does it matter that you were an object of racism? Does it matter that you're entering a white avatar?
You can hear me, you're cutting out again, as in you're gone, not just cutting out. Sounds like we probably lost her now. Let me just, in case she doesn't see us, I'm just going to stop her slide sharing so she notices something's up. Perhaps, are you back? Yep. Still can't hear you.
I said, I'm back. You've lost the sense.
Yes. Now we can hear you.
It was
Fantastic.
intentional. We've lost the sense of self. Now the sense of self has come. The sense of embodiment has come back. So again, this is an embodiment qualitatively. It's embodiment quantitatively. And the qualitative results are really interesting. So what makes me excited about the qualitative work, you go back to the clinic. So usually in clinical work, you start with like clinical observations, qualitative observations, and then you go into experiments. And what's really exciting here is that, we have like, the hardcore experiments. We're using like, advanced neurotechnologies, but then our measurements can go back to being qualitative again. That like like what participants say and their experience in the virtual world is actually sometimes as powerful as, these clinical observations. Not to say that the quantitative data isn't great, but the qualitative data has been really interesting to speak about. So, I won't read them all, but you can take a quick overview. It's really interesting. So some people just had no sense of embodiment, even if their scores were quite high, which is interesting. So quantitatively, they scored quite high in a questionnaire, but their qualitative remarks were very different, that they just didn't feel connected to the body, that they had movement and maybe they forgot about their own body, but they didn't have that connection. But overall, thanks to the amazing work that Sashin has been doing, there's over 69 interviews to look at. That's a lot of interviews. So he's just started this minefield, but in the really wonderful work that he's been doing. And again, just huge credit to Sash for the quantitative work. It's been really interesting to read these qualitative observations because no one in the field, whether they use IVR, whether they've used the rubber hand illusion, almost no one has actually looked at qualitative data. I think there was 2 studies that we could find that used qualitative methods. I'll read one of them for you. I would move my real body and then I would see my action being reflected in the VR mirror. And that's it. I knew it was me. The VR body in mirror 1. There was, yeah, and the embodiment part of the experiment takes 4 minutes. It doesn't take very much for us to kind of experience this illusion, even if it's in another body of another race group that within a South African context, is highly racialized. So we have a lot more. I hope I didn't disappoint you with not as much data as I hoped as I hope to have to present to you today on it. Let me just go back to the side. There's still a lot of data to look at and a lot of data to plow through in terms of really looking at this question. So in implicit and explicit measures, was there a change? Was there a reduction of prejudice? Was there a difference in implicit and explicit awareness? Was there any correlation with the physiological data that we acquired? It was very difficult to acquire. Might not be very good data, but we'll try. There's a second part of the experiment that we didn't go into in terms of interaction with other avatars. So we'll look at movement data and to see, maybe you said you felt, connected to your body, but maybe there was a difference in terms of the level of closeness you had towards somebody that looked like you in the virtual world and somebody that didn't look like you. And of course, many, many individual differences that we can look at in terms of the questionnaire data and the correlations there. So in the last very few minutes they have available, in thinking about these kind of big picture ideas, so what matters? So we know the brain matters, but what else matters? Firstly, one central argument is that self-awareness is grounded in the body. So the body matters. When we're looking at consciousness, when we're looking at this question of self-awareness, the body is important. But the bodily self is socially mediated, which is our second central argument. So other people matter. We develop a sense of self-awareness in the context of others. Other people, our social context and environment are important to this construction of self-consciousness but more specifically, bodily self-consciousness, so this minimal sense of self. And to think critically, I hope we've also managed to kind of place ourselves, challenge ourselves, engage in some introspection, place ourselves within the research and really become aware of systemic racism within the methods we use and a problem of lack of representation in the samples that we're using, in the participants that we recruit to our studies or the clinical populations that we're working with. So again, diversity matters. And lastly, quite a strong argument to make is that, when you're studying the brain and when you're studying, the brain within a body, and we're looking at this question of self-awareness, is that social diversity can actually shape not just, who we are in terms of our phenomenal experience of the world, but it can also shape our biology. And if we ignore these diversity matters, we're actually not, being good biologists or being good neuroscientists, because we're not understanding how social diversity can shape the self, can shape the body, and can shape the brain. And so you and your story matter. And we need to start being a little bit more introspective and engage as objective scientists, engage in a little bit more subjectivity and thinking about ourselves, our story, and positionality within our research. And so I hate acknowledgement slides because you always think you're going to forget someone. And I'm sure I did, and it's taking ages to load, but here it is. Many people to acknowledge, because we covered lots of research, many funders, supervisors, collaborators, students, trainees. I'd like to think of us all as co-designing and collaborators all together. So thank you to everybody, and apologies if I've missed someone. I really tried hard not to, but I'm sure I did. And thank you for being a really patient audience with my lack of awareness. I'll try to put on my camera again, bring back the self view, and with my very fast way of speaking, I hope these central messages and these big picture ideas came through while going through a lot of research quite quickly. So thank you, and thank you again for the invitation, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview of all the work that you've been doing over the last decade, really. Some impressive. We have time for a couple of questions, not too many because I'm aware of the time. And I'm going to get us started with a question from Valentina. She sent it in, and the question is, I have to read it. It's quite eloquently phrased, so I don't want to
prepare
mess
myself
up.
for it. I'm sure it's a hard question.
Would you expect an impact of societal differences on the efficacy of self-awareness rehabilitation strategies that rely on the modulation of social cognition, like first third-person perspective taking and mentalizing?
Yeah. What was the first part again? So the effect of?
Hang on, I'll post it as well so you can read it. Expect an impact of societal differences on the efficacy of self-awareness.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So like I said, this kind of work it's not just, they're socially important questions. So if I'm understanding the question again, within a clinical lens. So let's say your doctor is, of another race group or of another gender, right? Does that influence that kind of bias? Does it influence, how well you receive the treatment, what you think about the treatment? I think, yeah. I mean, and I think this is why, becoming aware as researchers, but also as a population, this is why these strategies should be used within science communication. They should be open to society. They help us become aware of our own biases, because yes, if you don't trust your doctor, we've shown, experimentally, these are implicit biases kind of affect our behavior and affect the way we think. It can placebo is very powerful as well. It affects the not the advocacy, there's another word. It affects the efficacy. That's it, the efficacy of rehabilitation treatment. I would think, yes, we would have to design something together, Vale, to see how we can experimentally test this, or how we can but we can. And I think contexts like South Africa, but also in the rest of the world, we're having more and more diverse doctors. We can see that society and the political climate we are in right now is becoming uncomfortable with these things. So we have to approach it in if it's in a school setting, a clinical setting, a normal setting, and things like immersive virtual reality can be a really, really powerful tool, and more a cheap tool as well to do this. Yeah, thanks.
I'm sure she's up for developing something, but that also nicely leads to the next question that we got for you, which is, do you think IVR can be used to assist individuals with phantom limb pain, similar to Ramachandra's assertion mirrors can be used to treat pain as it adopts similar concepts to right hemisphere illusion.
Yeah, I mean that's a great I should know, but I don't know if people have done that. They probably have done that. I mean his mirror box illusion works quite well. It's a little bit different because you're still in your body, you're just seeing another kind of perspective. I think IVR would be much more powerful because you actually have like a whole body illusion. It's almost like an out of body experience, the way Olaf Blanke describes it, right? You have a chance to leave your body and enter the body of an avatar. I hope I explained that well in the many things I was saying, but you actually like that's what makes it so powerful. You enter the body of a virtual body. So yes, I wonder if people have done it. It's always hard to find people with phantom limbs. So again, what I was saying about difficult kind of clinical work, and then you have to have the neurotechnology available to you. So if they haven't done it, let's do it. So let's make these technologies more accessible, the kind of worlds we use easier to develop, open access resources, so we can kind of, if it hasn't been done, it should be done. And I think it would be very effective. Yes.
Fantastic. Anna was first, I believe.
Well, it's nice to see you again, Sahba. Thank you so much for the talk. I have a question about a comparison that you might have done or thought of, or maybe somebody else in the field has done it with kids. So we know obviously like the self-awareness and like theory of mind, all this stuff basically that evolves throughout the development. And I was that's just a random thought that came out during your presentation was if kids are so all this kind of like racial stereotypes that kids are not necessarily exposed to for such a long time as adults, might that have an effect on, you know, the perspective taking or the self-awareness? Yeah, everything
I think
that you
that's
talked
great.
about.
Like we've been trying to do a little bit more developmental work, mostly within longitudinal birth cohorts, together with Whitney Ramasamy, that was also involved in this project. Doing immersive virtual reality work with kids, I think is great. In South Africa, it's really hard to get ethics for, unfortunately, because people think it could be dangerous because it's seen as a medical technology. So I mean, of course, ethics is very important, but it doesn't. Like a lot of in the UK, people are doing it a lot. It's Dorothy, I'm trying to remember, she's great researcher in Durham. Together with Bob Kendridge, they've done a lot of developmental work with IVR, and it's safe. It's safe. It's like any adult. If you have a possible risk factor, if you have a history of epilepsy, you don't do it. Vertigo is usually controlled for, but I think developmentally, it's really interesting to look at. Doing kind of like looking at implicit biases in children. I don't think many people have done it yet. They have looked at things like perspective taking and social cognition. Again, because it's more sensitive. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people have done it, but I don't think so. I don't think the field isn't that big yet. But very old social psychological literature has shown that it's there from at least 4 years. There was the famous black doll study. As like a black child, you prefer the white doll. They think the black doll is bad. They attribute negative qualities. So we know that these biases start super, super young. And I actually did a more of a social talk around this and my own experiences with race and being a different skin color like than my kids, is that, there's nothing wrong with your kids seeing race. At first, as a parent, and I hope again it's okay to share this, when my kids started saying that like you're brown and we're peach, I got like super uncomfortable and I'm like, I'm doing something wrong as a parent. My kids are thinking about race and they're seeing color, but of course kids see color and there's nothing wrong with seeing color. They see color in other things. Why wouldn't they see color in my skin tone? But the attitude that they attributed to it is important.
Yeah.
And the danger with thinking like I did is that like, oh no, like my kids are, and you hear this, it's like a part of the white fragility literature is my kids don't see colors. They do see color. It's a normal thing. We all see color. This is black and this is green. We teach our kids to see color. Why won't they see it in skin? That's what really it is. But the attitude is that's when we start associating attitude to skin color, it becomes dangerous. And yeah, it'd be really, I think it's really important to kind of experimentally test things. And I think this is actually, it's also one of the keys to understanding the building blocks of consciousness. If we can understand very early on how these unconscious processes happen, how do we attribute attitude to something as like objective, like, it's a color so quickly developmentally. Like we still don't know the mechanisms there. It's a really good question. And I think IVR, when we get through like ethics and thinking about safety, could be very powerful. And I think kids love it. We know this also with digital assessment. They love it. They'll love to do this kind of science.
And we have
kids...
like VR stuff in museums and so on, right? Like people are doing like VR studies, and it's in Amsterdam actually. They're doing VR studies on kids, like how kids perceive art, for example. It's like a normal standard fun procedure to do. So maybe
I wouldn't go
there is
as far as normal
application.
and standard. Like in terms of ethics, it's still a big struggle the second you involve children.
Oh, I see. Maybe that could be an example to cite or to give when applying for ethical permissions.
Yeah, hang on, that was orange. That was great. But yeah, I think and this is why it's important to write about these kind of things as well, and to have these discussions. I presented this kind of work in ethics boards before for this reason. Like, I appreciate the importance of ethics, but it's also important to understand like what dangers, like the real risks and dangers, because it's classified as not only a neurotechnology, a medical technology. It can be seen as a lot more harmful than it is. I think so, but it needs to be tested, right? I think so. So we need to test it out. But generally, yeah, like we're using it in museums, but we don't need ethics to use it in a museum. And maybe that kind of work can help it. But sorry, I know we're out of time, Steph. I know.
It's
Thank you.
quite an interesting discussion, but also like it's not just the method where the ethical worry is centered around, right? It's also how you then apply it. So let's assume you bring avatars into children's rooms. That's a whole different level. And yes, you have the ethical dimension of trusting another adult, but it's just, there's a whole debate around.
And if it's online or offline or things, there's many within the world of gaming. There's lots of incidences of abuse, and especially like for vulnerable populations like women and young girls. So there's many. Ethics is not to say there's many, many, many ethical issues that we need to look into. But the other thing is that it's being done socially. So if we're not doing this as scientists, we're also being unethical. As scientists, we also have to kind of do the hard research to be able to inform policy. So they're not allowed to do things like this in the gaming world, or they're not allowed to use certain things like these in social media. So if we can do it scientifically, then we can inform policy more meaningfully, because like Steph said, there are a lot of abuses, and there's always a dark side to emerging technologies. And that's important to realize.
Eduardo has been patiently waiting.
Yeah, I almost forgot my question. No, okay. It was relating also to some developmental aspects. So I was wondering whether you looked into about this VR bodily awareness, whether you would expect or whether you've seen a difference between, say, people that have been raised in a more multicultural environment, or people that have been raised in a more say homogeneous environment.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, I can also just think about in South Africa, like diversity is always around you, like in terms of languages, but not necessarily so. It also depends on your social economic class. So if you're from quite a high social economic class, you can really live in a very homogeneous kind of like society. You surround yourself by, people that look like you. So in the work that we've been doing, we have been looking at differences in social economic status. It doesn't mean that you're like it's a little bit different, but there are huge differences actually. There are huge differences. It's one of the most significant factors that Stash, who's running a lot of the analysis, has found, is differences in social economic status, which leads me to think or to hypothesize that if you had to do a cross-cultural comparison, so let's say, being very biased, but let's say like Finland, but maybe Finland's becoming more culturally diverse. I don't know. Or Yemen in the Middle East, you have very, you have certain, like, and then you have the US or London, maybe. London's a very good diverse sample of people, and you compare like the heterogeneous and homogeneous societies within, these cross-cultural samples. I think that there would be a difference. Yeah, I think so. But we also live in the age of like social media and other kinds of media. So, yeah, I mean, it's not just our direct in-person experiences, right? It's also like, again, our virtual experiences. They might not be immersive, like immersive virtual reality, but you know, you get sucked into things. And so it's hard to really live in isolation anymore. But yeah, if we have good open access kind of resources available, maybe we could do more cross-cultural research easily. I don't know if that answers your question at
Yeah,
all,
no, a
but there
little
was
bit,
no.
yes. I mean, social media as well is a little bit tricky, right? Because the algorithms tend to spiral you down into sort of like a local minima of like it keeps you feeding you with what you like, whatever that might be, right? So that might also
Exactly.
be like a big
It's
village
nice.
anyway. But yeah, yeah, because my question was stemming for like thinking about yeah, I mean, in any kind at any level of cognition or perception, when we see like people are when people grown up like in so we say this like with faces, right? If you're used to like a certain kind of face, you
Yeah.
tend to recognize that a little bit better than the face of you say your out group. We
Yeah.
see that with language as well. So if you grow up in a community that is speaking one language, you get used to the phonemes of that language. But if you grow up in say a community that speak more languages, then you can manage like a more rich like a phoneme inventory and so on and so forth. Yeah. But
No,
yeah,
that's a
thank
good
you.
point. I mean, I would say Harry, a lot of Harry's work has actually looked at this in-group and out-group mentality, and it's not just in terms of race, in terms of many things. Any like cultural biases, gendered in groups and out groups. And so, I mean, I think that the powerful thing about IVR is that um you can also create these in groups and out groups. You know what I mean? Like superficially, there's things like the
Yeah, yeah.
social exclusion task. If you create like, you know, an immersive way of doing the social exclusion task experimentally, you can create an in group and an out group. And then you can have like an existing in group and out group. So there's many ways to look at it. I think it's really nice. And some people have started to do that, yes. And in a systematic review, Sarah will know more than me on this. Those 12 papers that really focused in on this question of in-group and out-group in terms of race, or race, because we do see race as a social construction. Yeah, it was very interesting how they found it. It was kind of like a rehabilitation in a way, like actually having an immersive being in the body of an out-group, at least temporarily, had a huge effect on your attitudes. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ting had a question for you as well. Ting, do you wanna ask your question?
Yeah, my question is about, so currently the social political trending towards right or conservatism. So how do we navigate to keep raising awareness in terms of diversity in science or in the society in general?
It's a really good question. And I think, I mean, thanks, Steph, for inviting me at this time to give this talk. My internet is gone. Am I back? My internet was unstable.
You're back now.
Am I back now? So yeah, it was very timely. I think I was very excited. And this is why I chose to give this kind of talk, is because of the current political climate. And it's, you know, it's in Europe, it's in the US, and it's scary. It's affecting our funding, it's affecting what we can say. So maybe after this talk, I'll never be fundable again, but I don't care. Like again, like, you know, like equity and social justice is important to me. Again, it's why I shared my personal story. In another world, in another environment, you know, I wouldn't have had any opportunities. You know, like we have to keep on fighting for social justice, especially when you're in a position to. As a South African, you also see what happens when you don't. When you don't kind of fight for social justice. You know, we have a lot of problems back home. There's a lot of, but at least we have like a liberal and open democratic society. You know, like there is that kind of freedom of thought and freedom to be who you want to be. Sometimes that impinges on your own rights as well. But I think, I mean, we need to also like speak about it in talks, and do good research on it. You know, this is, I think, what I was trying to say. It's not just a side conversation, is that, look, if we can show in using good science that these kind of diversity questions make a difference, they understand, I mean, it can help us understand, like, the hard problem of consciousness, of phenomenal awareness, on if machines are aware or not. That's huge. Like, but we can only kind of approach, like, I hope I made that point clear. Like, these big kind of questions are only possible when we think about diversity. If we don't, then, like Eduardo was even saying, in terms of the biases and what you see in your social media, these biases are just going to replicate to a bigger and bigger scale, to a bigger and bigger scale. If it's within our political environments, what we see, what, like, we all use ChatGPT, let's not lie. We use generative AI every day, and it's completely biased because it's just built on not representative data. So I think and also form a community, I guess, form a community for like-minded support, because I think it is going to be an uphill battle. And I mean, we shouldn't change who we are just to get funded. We've learned that from being, from a South African context. I think we need to make sure we don't do that. We don't do that. I know a lot of people that worked as neuroscientists in apartheid South Africa. You change your beliefs so you can get, government funding, but it's also not right. You know what I mean? Don't like that within. It's going to be harder and harder to get research money, and so it's going to be an upward battle. So having a supportive community can hopefully, allow us to keep on having these difficult conversations, and also, really think critically about the politics of funding. Who funds research? For what agenda is this research being funded? Do you want to be a part of that? Maybe you won't do such high profile science for a while, but I mean, that's something that you have to think about as a researcher. The ethics is important. These ethical questions and how you go forward. I don't know if that helped or if that gave any kind of answer to your question, but just a few thoughts there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the reason I raised this question is just because I right now I just sort of have this fear of putting some more progressive turn in my research or things like that. So, well, it's very nice to hear from someone to say that, okay, we still need to keep pushing and keep talking about an informed community. So thank you.
No, thank you. And just to say, I hear you as well, especially as an early career researcher, and especially as students, it's really hard. It's really hard to kind of take these positions because you're more vulnerable, like you need PhD funding and you need it's hard. And I mean, I'm still an early career researcher myself, but it's also a challenge to the senior people out there, the established researchers to be a voice. And there are, like, Nancy Kenrichiger. Oh, I've said her name terribly, but she's a really good example. She's one of the leading pioneers of female MRI research. She's always very strong in terms of her social views, and people like her are really strong role models that, when you're an established scientist, your voice can really, really make a difference. So I'm glad to hear my voice made a little bit of a difference, but yeah. A challenge to the big researchers out there too.
There is one more comment from Candice, I believe. Looks like she's frozen now. What's going on today? Candice, you're frozen.
Frozen.
Yes. Do you want to switch off your video?
Okay.
Now I can take perspective of when I was frozen.
So I have a lot of thoughts and a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to. No.
You were with us this entire time.
This is absolutely someone's hacking the MPI.
Oh, working now. Quick.
Can you still hear me though?
Yeah.
Can you hear me though?
Yes. We can hear you.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. So I think it's terrible, isn't it? One thing I was thinking is, at least in the English-speaking world, interesting. It's super dead.
We can hear you, Candice.
Okay, there we go. In the English-speaking world, I think we associate race very often with skin color. but I think there is a huge cultural aspect to this where race can be associated with things like movement or shape of like facial features or different aspects of physical shape. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about this or if you had looked into any of this when you were preparing your avatars.
Yeah, I mean it's really profound and a really good question. And just to say from the systematic review, I mean they did look at this, for example, within a Singaporean population. So they were all kind
Right.
of seen as ethnically Chinese, but there was differences, right, between like
Mhm.
Singaporean and Malaysian. And so that can also be seen as race, although it's not
Mhm.
color. It's
Yes.
within, ethnicity can be seen. So that's very important. It is, but there are physical markers, right? So it is
Mhm.
harder to kind of, and this is where stereotyping can become a bit dangerous, but they
Mhm.
managed to do it, and even if you
Okay.
tell somebody like this person is, Singaporean
Mhm.
Chinese or Malaysian Chinese, it has the same effect. They had the same effect
Mhm.
with those populations. I also was recently in Rwanda, and I went to the genocide memorial, which we all should when we
Mhm.
go to Rwanda or to other places with a similar kind of history. And as we know there, it wasn't about race. They created kind
Yeah.
of a racial division within two ethnic tribes, and they
Mhm.
did exactly what you were saying. The colonial legacy was that they like measured like how big their nose was, their facial features, so
Mm.
they could make it like physically from their physical features. That
Yeah.
might be, oh, now my connection is stable. I hope I'm back.
No, we
Um,
got you. We got you.
right. So yes, like when you get to these kind of intricacies, it's not just skin color. Skin color is
Yeah.
just the easiest one to change in IVR because it's likeness,
Yeah, exactly.
things like this. But you can change other features or even gender. So you
Mhm.
can change gender, but how do we change gender? Is it in terms of body type or
Yeah.
hair? It's also kind of stereotypical. So you have to acknowledge these biases. You will run into, I think,
Yeah.
racial stereotyping as you do it. But
Mm.
I think if you speak about it, it's all right.
Yeah.
I don't know, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. But
Yeah.
yes, it's a really powerful comment, and thank you for that. That it's beyond just skin color. Skin color
Yeah.
is the way of thinking about,
Yeah.
racial divisions, but there's a lot more, there's
Yeah.
different intricacies there. Yeah.
And I wonder if there's any quantitative research on that. Oh, Argentina. We all know Canada's Italian. Whatever. Yeah, so one of the things I was thinking is if anyone's actually tried to quantify this and look at what the parameters are to distinguish races or ethnic groups or things like that according to culture, because I think that varies very widely. And the second thing I was thinking was, sorry, I know you talked about like 10 years of research in 2 minutes, so I understand you didn't have time to go into a lot of detail, but you talked about this embodiment in Avatar that looked different, but what was around them? Because I can imagine a situation of embodiment can be very different if you are being contrasted with others that look like your normal self or like your avatar self or like a third option. So I was wondering if you'd looked into how embodiment interacts with the surrounding
The environment.
environment. And
Yeah, it's a really nice question. So, I mean, it's something we'd like to look at, and it's something that actually Sash and Danielle and me have spoken about. For now, it's in a really, and this is something that the people have said qualitatively, again, co-design methods are important, is that it's like in a warehouse. It's very, just because, you
yeah.
want to take out the social elements,
Yeah.
objective scientists, let's remove everything else, let's have it in like a basic room, but that's also
Mhm.
quite sterile and it's not realistic, right? So
Yeah.
we were just interested in the body aspect, not the
Mhm.
environment right now.
Yeah.
There are other people that come in. So yeah, that's where the distance data comes in. So do you
Yeah.
tend to get closer to people that look like you, like the
Mhm.
way you identify, or look like your physical avatar? And so we have to look at all of that. That's going to be super
Yeah.
interesting. You also
Yeah.
have to look at the limitations of IVR. The gaming space is quite small as well.
Yeah.
And like people like digital also awareness. So some people that have a lot of gaming background just like moved around. Other people
Yeah.
scared, were a little bit like apprehensive. And so
Yeah.
we'll see. This is the first of hopefully many more studies. Like we'll see how the digital divide is something I didn't speak about, but it is there. And it's interesting how even with the digital divide, man, people love it. Like they're not, some people are scared, but not really. Like a lot of people, I wish I could record some of the participants. They were just like so excited. It was so nice to see. Like they just loved it.
Yeah.
It was cool.
Yeah.
But in terms of the environment, so this is something that Olivia has spoken about, that I mentioned before. The neuroethicist, to say that, you know, in all of these worlds, like you never have like a township represented, which is an underrepresented. It's an informal settlement in South Africa, or a village. Like think about in Argentina, in South America, is there like a village represented in any of these worlds? Like an indigenous village? Probably not.
No.
But like, so that's something we really like to do.
Yeah.
Hopefully Sash will develop
Yeah.
this in part of his PhD, is to say,
Yeah.
if you have a more ecologically valid environment, does it make a difference? You know, it's
Yeah.
like it's your normal, like let's say you just recreate your campus surrounding.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
a thing, yeah, I mean, that's really nice. We were talking about this with Steph before. It's really hard to do, like the actual
Yeah.
like coding. We need people like Chris on board. But
Yeah.
if you have more diversity within the science, maybe these worlds will become more open access. You know, people will make them and
Yeah.
share them. And that's the hope, I guess, that we share these resources. And yeah, and we
Yeah.
create, so when you want to know what it feels like to be in somebody else's body, it's not just their body. As we showed in the other work, it's also like their wider social context. Like what does it feel like to really be within the space?
Yeah.
And in the tech study that I talked about, we haven't looked at it because I think empathy is just something very hard to measure, but it also people have shown that it increases empathy. You know, it doesn't increase prejudice, it can increase empathy. I just think it's hard to measure, but we'll get there. But yeah, so it can also create, you know, positive feelings. I'll maybe end. I don't know how much time we have. I'm not sure if anybody's read To Kill a Mockingbird and Atticus Finch. You know, there's the famous quotation that, you know, you have to walk in somebody else's shoes, be in somebody else's shoes and walk around before you can really understand them. And that's why VR is so powerful, is that it really allows you to embody another person, and hopefully this kind of can actually change, you know, our attitudes, maybe our with the way we think of the world politically within our current political climate. And yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up walking in somebody else's shoes, because that is a huge definitional issue, right? So what is someone's shoes?
Yeah.
Because sort of going back to what I was asking about before, somebody else's shoes can be just their skin color, or it can be the way they walk, or it can be the environment that they're placed in, and the fact that they look like everyone else in the environment rather than looking different. So I think obviously there's just like a lot of places to go with this. Yeah.
And I think that like for now, these are just the initial quantitative results, at least, that shows that like across conditions, at least the quantitative reports were quite similar. For me, it's not what I expected. Like I really thought it would have been different. Like, but I mean it's interesting and it's great, like it, because it does show like a universality that maybe yeah, this feeling of embodiment is much more fluid. Like it's not as I thought. No. My initial hypothesis was that if you're a Black participant, you enter an other white avatar, that wider history and social context is gonna affect. I mean, that's like at least within the South African context, I really thought there would be, you do see some of this qualitatively in terms of people saying, interestingly, it was sometimes the opposite. Some of the Black identifying participants were like, but I felt so much more comfortable in the white avatar because people always called me an Oreo anyway. So now, like, I know it, like, I mean, it's really interesting. The qualitative things, it's like, it's really rich to really go into. And I'll mention the work of Frans Fanon. He's the founder of, like psychoanalytic perspectives. He wrote White Skins, Black Masks. No, Black Skin, White Mask. This idea of the Oreo cookie is that when you know, look different, but you know, you try to be more whiter. But like you said, it's beyond skin color. It can also just be in the way you are, or the way you are as a woman, even the way like the way you need to be, or you think you need to be within a masculine society. But these are all great questions, Candace. I hope you kind of do this kind of work and bring in MRI and EEG, and we can look at the NORC. I didn't speak about that, but it'd be really interesting to see what's going on in the brain at the same time, right? And we're moving towards that too in terms of movement artifact. You have to, so the way immersive virtual reality works is that you have to move. Movement is also important. So this is a big problem. I've been thinking about it a lot. I thought, let's do the embodied side where it involves movement. And then maybe you're still and you can get brain recordings while you're watching a video. That's the way I've thought about getting around the movement artifact. But some new kind of EEG methods actually are okay with movement artifacts. So yeah, please, the neuroanatomical people, think of ways where we can integrate some brain recordings in there as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hate to cut this discussion.
Sorry.
We're over time at this point. I'm very aware that people have things to do and places to go to. But if it's okay with you, the questions that we haven't addressed, I would hand them over to you, and we can put the answers underneath the video on the YouTube channel so everyone gets a little piece of you. But thank you so much for the presentation, for giving us this fantastic overview. And as always, it's been absolutely enthusiastic and a whirlwind of information. Always a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.